Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be talking about the relationships between trauma, mental health, and substance use. Anne, Megan, and Jerry, you've all kind of alluded to some of those impacts, but if you could speak to some of the physical and mental health effects of trauma, that would be great.
I can start because it's really been the focus of our practice at the Tribal Defender's Office really since 2009. We just started seeing so many people struggling with mental health and substance use disorders. And often that resulted in them really progressing from tribal court cases into the state system and still not addressing the underlying issues. So one of the issues we had to address was really access to services. It's been so difficult to access services. And so we started out by having psychologists in our office so that people could be seen within days of one of our defenders identifying an issue. Now we have case managers that also try to address access to services. But that's the primary thing that we've been struggling with. I see the prevalence of mental health issues just increasing, especially in the last 2 years. We're now going to have 2 mental health client advocates that'll be going into our tribal jail every day of the week and reaching out to newly arrested people, doing a mental health screen for those people, and then offering services at that point to try to engage people while they're in that crisis of being in jail. Just thinking that early intervention and often is the way to offer services and try to get people to engage. And then when they're also dealing with homelessness, it's hard to engage people in services. That's really all related to trauma. So that's how we've been trying to deal with that.
Thank you, Megan. Maybe you can speak a little bit more to the relationship between trauma and mental health and substance use disorders.
We know that individuals are impacted by trauma holistically, more than just the symptoms, the hallmark symptoms of trauma. We know that individuals are impacted physically, behaviorally, cognitively, spiritually, emotionally, and that people experience and the effects of trauma differently than others. There's a lot of reasons why people are affected by trauma differently. It's a common question. How come somebody has experienced this, but yet somebody else has also experienced a similar event, but yet they are having various different effects from that? And there's various reasons for that: age, prior history of trauma, the perception of that event, the connection to that event. The list goes on. Those risk and protective factors that go along with that. But overall, what we know is that trauma impacts our stress response systems, and coping with those trauma effects can lead us to engaging in high-risk behaviors, and including substance use, reckless driving. The list goes on when we try to cope with such events. And that trauma also affects, especially if we experience trauma early on, we can have difficulty with impulsivity, with impaired decision-making, with difficulty planning and thinking about the future, thinking through consequences of our behavior. Those are all executive functioning skills that are within our prefrontal cortex. And we know when our stress response system's activated, we're not able to easily do these functions. On a regular basis, these functions become impaired. And so we have to be able to combat those. And we can see that within the trajectory of experiencing symptoms, trying to cope with those symptoms, either positively or negatively, and engaging in high-risk behaviors then puts us at risk for injury, for problems, mental health and health problems, and that those then lead to long-term effects on our health up to a lower life expectancy. So we can see that trajectory and increased involvement in the justice system.
Thank you, Megan. You mentioned PTSD a bit ago. For those that aren't familiar with PTSD, would you mind talking about some of the symptoms and what it can look like?
Sure. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that's defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychological Disorders. And what we see is some people differentiate child or traumatic stress and the PTSD, particularly because people can experience traumatic stress and not meet the criteria for PTSD, depending on different factors. But PTSD is a defined mental health disorder with specific symptoms that you need to have, and that these symptoms persist over 30 days. And it I guess the key thing about this is that it affects an individual's ability to engage in activities of daily living, affects their daily functioning in some way.
I would also add to that, after being in the Marine Corps for 6 years, I remember it was starting to get discussed a lot more with active duty military as well as veterans. And I was in the Gulf War, being more cognizant of my own behaviors, of how it affected me with my relationships and my daily life. But what I also found interesting was all of those things that they recommended I be cognizant of and watch out for my own behaviors or how it may have changed me. We see those responses and those types of actions with our victims of crime and our child victims, our domestic violence victims. They're experiencing the same PTSD as returning from war veterans. And so that, I think, as a prosecutor and again, as a Native woman, it helped me to understand not only myself and the issues of PTSD and coping mechanisms, but also looking for help and realizing that when I am working with a victim who has experienced a traumatic event, that those resources that are the same that they would recommend for veterans need to be available and are very helpful to help our victims so that they're not living in that cycle of trauma and they can recognize and be able to establish coping mechanisms. But I think that it was an eye-opening experience to not only understand myself, but also become a better practitioner and working with community members, victims, suspects, and in my other relationships with other professionals.
People who experience trauma experience hallmark symptoms. They can include hypervigilance, disassociation, re-experiencing, avoidance. And so these are some hallmark things that people experience regardless of the type of trauma that they may have experienced. And the severity of those may be different, and the way that you might see them might be different, but those are some core things that people commonly experience.
I'm wondering if any of you would like to speak more about the relationship between trauma and substance use specifically. I think especially Anne and Megan may have some more to say on that topic.
I think if I had to guess, I would say that 90% of my clients who are experiencing substance use disorders have experienced trauma. And my guess is that that may be even higher. And I've been looking at that as not a mental health professional, but as a holistic defense practitioner, if I can call myself that. I've really been looking at that as identifying it as a mental health issue overall. And I find that the justice system generally wants to compartmentalize the accused and possibly victims of either having a substance use disorder or a mental health disorder. And often the justice system wants to diagnose that when they impose conditions on our clients and say, go get a chemical dependency assessment, go get a mental health evaluation. And we've been trying to change that trend by having people screened by our psychologists ahead of time so that we can identify where the issue lies. But to some extent, I think it's all just trying to have mental health wellness and really addressing the issues overall. So if substance use is something that's resulted from trauma or something that's resulted from a mental health disorder, then let's just deal with it as a mental health issue and try to support people according to what their needs are.
Thank you. And Megan and Jerry, in your work with victims and survivors and witnesses who've experienced trauma, what have you seen or noticed in terms of their substance use and how it relates to those experiences?
I absolutely see the abuse of substances as a coping mechanism. It is often used to numb from trauma experiences, from the pain, from loss, from all of these things. Substances are an easy way to just do a mind escape from the daily issues, the reminders, the triggers, if you will. So one of the things that I find difficult, but this takes a holistic, if you will, Anne, a holistic or multidisciplinary approach, because if someone goes to substance abuse rehabilitation or substance abuse, some type of clinic or rehab, then what happens is they've been gone maybe 6 weeks, maybe longer, and they get to feeling better, they're away, they're clean, they learn how to better address stresses, but they come right back home to the triggers and the stress and the trauma that led them to that in the first place. And unfortunately, what I see in Indian country is the prevalence of abusing substances is rampant. And there needs to be not only a way to address this for the abuser, the user of drugs, but if we go into the home, it's never just that one. There may be children who are using, there may be elders who are using. And it has to be a comprehensive approach, because you can't take one person out of it and help them to heal and then put them back in that situation. It becomes an ongoing revolving process, but we have to think smarter in our approach to this and recognize that it is the drug, but the drug is also masking something else. Let's get down to what is really going on so we can be able to address it and not put a Band-Aid on a cancerous tumor. Let's get down to really addressing what is the fundamental problem. And let's do that. It's a lot harder, but I mean, when we consider the money and the resources and the time, it's worth that investment for our people and for the communities.
People use it because it works. In the short term, it does help people cope in the short term, to numb, to not feel. But again, they're not thinking about the long-term consequences and the long-term effects of continued use. And then it becomes dependency. And then we do have to address not just the substance use and dependency, but the underlying trauma.
Thank you. That reminds me that for me, one of the most important ideas in thinking about trauma-informed practice is helping all of us shift as individuals and systems from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And that when we can make that shift, it really changes everything, right, in how we work with folks. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on trauma and implications for tribal justice systems. I'd like to thank my 3 panelists for joining me in this wonderful conversation, and thank you as well for joining us.